Passover holiday, and I know I'm actually just newly back, so I'm still working on re-entry after the holiday. But it's been an incredibly eventful few weeks, and so we're excited to have a really robust conversation today. So as a reminder, we're coming together as this Four Rabbi series. What started off with the group of us who have been studying through the Hartman Institute. So myself, coming from the JCRC, Rabbi Daniel Bogard from Central Reform Congregation, and Rabbi Jim Bennett from Congregation Sher Emet. And now we're so excited to have special guests, and we're joined today by Rabbi Micah Buck Yael, who is the Director of Education at Keshet. I hope I got that title correct. And you will have some time to tell us more about Keshet and all the work that you do. And we had planned this out well in advance. I know that rabbi schedules fill up really quickly, and so all of our guests had been scheduled out, but it feels like there's no more appropriate time, Micah, to have you than now, because what we're really experiencing right now, after years and years of intense fighting across the country, but particularly here in the state of Missouri, and specifically anti-trans legislation, although more broadly anti-LGBTQ legislation that has been happening, we're really at an incredibly low point in the state of Missouri. And maybe I'll just say a quick word of some of where we are right now. But then I want to pass it to you, Micah, to kind of ground us in some Torah before we open up the conversation. So I think many of you might know that for years there has been efforts to ban and criminalize, in particular, trans children. Although really that's been sort of just a conduit for a broader conversation, I would argue, about anti-LGBTQ attitudes in the state of Missouri. And what we've been seeing in previous years has been efforts to ban children from playing sports on sports teams, except according to the gender that they were assigned at birth, and bills to criminalize and to ban healthcare for children under the age of 18, gender-affirming healthcare for children under the age of 18. This year, we saw those bills come back, but added to it were bills to also forbid teachers from talking about gender and sexuality in schools, bills to ban drag performances and to criminalize drag. All of these, I mean, we can unpack all of these, but all of these kind of is part of these broader efforts. And so the bills, the healthcare bill and the athlete bill passed the Senate. We've been awaiting them passing the House and going into law. And then in the midst of all that, Missouri's Attorney General made a big announcement last week, essentially, I don't know, do we call it an executive order if it's the Attorney General? But essentially like an order, if you want to correct my language, you're welcome to jump in. Essentially an order basically banning all gender affirming care, except in very, very restrictive and very difficult circumstances. And then they clarified that those restrictions would go into place not only for children, but also for adults as well. And so we're seeing Missouri being in the lead in the country, and really in about a week, about to ban effectively all forms of gender affirming care for all trans individuals. So we're at an incredibly painful point, and this is obviously something I know Daniel and I have been talking a lot about. Mike, this is something that's incredibly close to your heart and that you're really passionate about. I know we'll have time to unpack all of that. Jim, I don't mean not to call you out. I know you're very passionate about this as well, and have been also really involved in this in a variety of ways. So that's like the really broad grounding. And I know that was like a very, very complex system that's been happening, trying to condense that into 5 minutes. But before we get into the actual discussion of it, we've got a group of rabbis here. Keshet is a Jewish organization. So Micah, maybe you can start off by just like, give us like the brief, like on one foot of like what Keshet is, just for anyone who's here who doesn't know what it is that you do. And let's ground this in the Jewish texts that are really driving us in all of this.
Absolutely. And first I want to say thank you so much for the opportunity to here and learning and teaching and in conversation with three of the most amazing members of our community, leaders, minds, teachers, all of this. Keshet is an organization that works for the full equality of all LGBTQ Jews and our families in Jewish life. So we work with organizations across North America. And we work in three ways. One is through education and training, where we believe that communities, when they have the information, the tools, the practice, and the confidence to build affirming communities, can enact organization level and individual level change to be places where all members of our Jewish communities can thrive. We also have a youth programming team where we work to build spaces where LGBTQ Jewish youth can build community as their full, authentic, celebratory selves, fully seen and valued in all of who they are. And we have a community mobilization team where we work to bring Jewish communities, particularly and specifically as a religious voice, to the work for LGBTQ civil rights in the United States. And so in my role as a director of education and training, I really focus on what are the things that we can do differently when we know differently? What are the ways that we can make our Jewish communities places of celebration, havens, and places of strength? And I will say that especially as a queer and trans Jew living in Missouri at this time, I think it has never been more important that our Jewish communities be safe havens and places of celebration for members of our community. I can never resist an opportunity to connect this teaching and this learning and this work with a little bit of Torah. And I want to share with you that Keshet has recently brought out a collection of 7 Jewish values for taking action, which if you want to have it in front of you, you can look at it at keshetonline.org/7, the number 7, values for action. And I want to focus us in, and the idea here is, I think often the Torah does not use the language around gender identity, around sexual orientation, around transness that we use right now. And that is a completely expected situation, right? That Torah survives as a document because even without using the same language for concepts that we use today, it has wisdom to teach us, it has tools to offer us, and it has moral claims to present us with. Oh, fabulous. Thank you. Thank you. Oh, nope, different one. Actually, I'm going to plop this in the chat for you so that I can, Rabbi Bogard, get you the one that I am going to be teaching from. There we go. 7 values for action. And it's going to come up in just a moment. And I want to direct us to value number 3, this notion of lo ta'amod al dam re'echa, do not stand by. And there's this line from the very heart, the very center of the Torah, the book of Leviticus, Vayikra. And I want to point us there because so often, in particular of all the Jewish texts, this comes from the collection of chapters that are most often used as a weapon against LGBTQ people. And I want to point us to the lines and the texts that actually live at the heart of that book. And there's a verse in which we read, Lo telech rachil be'amecha, do not go as a talebearer or deal basely with your people. Lo ta'amod al dam re'echa, do not stand on or stand by the blood of your fellow. Ani Adoshem, I am the eternal. And there's this question of what exactly does it even mean to say not to stand on or not to stand by? The blood, the suffering, the guilt, that word dam can mean a lot of different things. Value is also a translation we can have for that word dam, meaning blood. So one of the common ways that we understand this is there's an obligation never to stand by when the safety of somebody else is threatened. And right now, I want to be absolutely crystal clear. The safety of trans and non-binary people, youth as well as adults, is directly threatened. Not against a backdrop anymore of proposed legislation, not against the drumbeat of negative rhetoric, although we're going to get to that in a minute, but by actual and concrete changes to the rules by which we can access potentially life-saving medical care. The life and well-being of the trans community is under threat in a very dramatic way. And so I want to offer us the call that there is nothing more Jewish, and there is nothing that comes more from the very heart and very core of the Torah than the notion that we don't stand by. And I actually want to back up, and I kind of ended there, but I wanted to, before I got there, I wanted to say something. You'll notice that I read more of the verse than I quoted on this screen, right? On this screen, we quoted, "Don't stand by, beginning, middle, and end." But there's actually something really powerful that happens in the verse because it lumps together these two concepts, right? Don't be a tale bearer. Don't be spreading gossip. Don't be spreading negativity among your people, comma, don't stand by their blood. And there is a traditional understanding that says, actually, what does it mean that those two concepts, the way we talk about people, is connected to this concept of risk to one's life and well-being, standing by their blood? I want to name, right now we're in a place where we are talking about the actual contents of the rules, restrictions, and regulations that we are facing, and that we are in a backdrop where even the language and the conversation has become incredibly damaging to the well-being of, I will say, trans and non-binary people of all ages. And I also want to name very particularly those of us who might be younger, those of us who might be figuring out how to put language to our identities and stories for the very first time, whatever age we are when we do that. That coming into oneself in a world that says, your government doesn't value you, your doctors can't care for you, people debate the validity of your identity and your story on the news and fight it out in our legislative chambers. That is not an environment of wholeness, affirmation, and celebration. So I want to invite us to this conversation. I know our title is Unlimited Opinions, but I want to invite us to this conversation with a framing of, we are talking about the how of enacting this notion of lo ta'amod, that we don't stand idly by. And that's where we are.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I want to just lift up, if I can. I'm going to jump in. I'm sort of acting a little bit as moderator, but I want to name that I'm obviously deeply invested in this conversation, and so I might jump in a little bit more than I might otherwise, as usually a moderator in it. But so much of what you said resonated with me, and I think it is important to name that while oftentimes we do try. We're a group of people who come from a wide variety of experiences. There's diversity in terms of the denominations, where we've been ordained, the work that we do, where we devote our day-to-day lives. And so we bring with us a plurality in terms of perspectives. And in this case, we have not tried to build a group of people to debate with one another about this. And part of that is really lifting up this question of, what should debate even look like? And I think that one of the things that I've been experiencing in this, and you named it, but I just really want to emphasize, is the ways in which this legislation being proposed has given permission to people to think that this is a dinner table conversation, right? Suddenly, like, it's okay for people to have opinions. And the idea that, like, when people sort of say, oh, well, either we sort of say, like, oh, this is political, right? And so the idea that, like, as soon as this starts to be debated in political circles, then people get uncomfortable. So now, I can't take an opinion on it because it's controversial. We need to be nonpartisan. Whereas, like, people's identity should never be something that's controversial, nor should it ever be something that, well, now that it's in the news and now that our elected officials are talking about it, well, like, we're all entitled to have an opinion. And certainly on the one hand, as individuals, we all do have opinions on things, but the idea that my opinion should be about how you should live your life and therefore should involve me having an opinion on whether or not I can legislate or restrict is horrifying to me. And so I think that's one of the things that is so discomforting and undermining, and I don't even totally have all of the language for it as I sit with all the emotions that go through me, is that we've given permission, we as a society have given permission for discrimination and hate to be normal parts of our conversation right now.
Rory, I want to thank you for saying that, and also thank you, Micah, for joining us today and lifting up what is both your personal and your professional passion and your deep values. And Rory, what you said, I absolutely resonate completely with on so many levels. And one thing I wanted to say before I add a couple of other thoughts was as I was glancing through those 7 values for action, Micah, which you shared, which are really worthy of deep study and attention by all of us on this Zoom, and everybody we know should be reading those, because ironically, they don't merely apply to the particular people we're referring to today who are at such grave risk of life and literally ability to live healthy, safe lives, but really these values apply to all of us, and even the first of them, which, you know, I don't want to brush it aside, the idea that all human beings are created in Jewish philosophy, theology. There is no way one can deny it, that Judaism holds dear the fundamental principle that all of us are created in God's image, and therefore every single human being is equally valuable. And as you said, Rory, you know, the politicization or the weaponization of attacks upon the women in our society, attacks upon the LGBTQ members of our society, and lately these horrifying and deeply offensive and terrorizing attacks upon the trans community. These aren't just passing phases. They should alarm us all. And I want to say this to the people that I know are watchers and listeners today, those of you who are on our call, and many of you are loyal monthly joiners of this call. Many of you may, on the one hand, say, well, yeah, I guess I kind of sort of support this cause, but, you know, it doesn't really impact me. It doesn't, you know, I don't have any trans member of my family. I may know somebody, you know, I care about, but, you know, maybe even this makes me a little personally uncomfortable because it's something outside my own realm of experience. I want to say that as a rabbi and as a Jew and as an American, this should alarm us all. These attacks, these political attacks upon the autonomy of each and every human being. And as you said, Rory, you know, that somebody else should be sitting in some legislative chamber or some courtroom deciding for me or you or your child or somebody else's child or anybody what we can and cannot do with our bodies and how we can and cannot choose to live our lives and who we can love. These should alarm us all. This is not the intention either of our religious faith. And I want to call out that we should be concerned about members of the Jewish community who actually are allies to those who are attacking human beings' dignity and respect. And we should not allow that to just go unchecked, whether in this country or in Israel. Members of the Orthodox community who are the enemy of trans people should be called out on it and should be reminded that their values are inconsistent with the core values of what we believe Judaism is all about. And Israel also, the government in Israel today should be held accountable for its corruption of and its complete disregard for these core values that are at the very center of Jewish life. And so I want us all to take this very seriously. And I was so honored to be able to welcome you today, Micah, because I think you stand for what we should all be standing for. And Daniel, I know you and Rory, both of you, are living your values each and every day, both personally and as leaders in the community. But the rest of us, for whom maybe these issues don't seem quite so personal upon first blush, should recognize that they are very personal. And if one member of our community is threatened, then all of us are threatened.
I really appreciate that, Jim and Micah and Rory. And Micah, I don't know if we told you, but we have a custom of first names for this. I want to hold up, because we're cycling around this question of partisan and political, and I want to add in the word tribal, because there's two pieces of this that really stand out to me. The first is that when you go down to Jeff City on the days the awful, grueling, traumatic, terrible days when sitting senators ask children what their genitals look like and ask our children whether they need to be protected from us and whether we're grooming them, and listening to sitting state senators say those things and call us pedophiles. And when you look at the activists who show up to protect trans kids in particular, it's so overwhelmingly a group of Jews. It's really inspiring. There was this one moment earlier this year where we took a group picture of everyone who had shown up at 8 a.m., right? 8 a.m. testimony means you're leaving St. Louis at 5:30. They do that on purpose, by the way. You show up there, and we took a group picture of us afterwards. And then we said, just kind of hollered out, okay, now Jews stay here. Let's have a Jewish community group picture. And there were like 3 people who walked away because it was that overwhelmingly of a Jewish crowd, which is incredible and beautiful. And I think is something about who American Jews are, and also what our values are, and the long history of Jewish memory, and the fact that there have always been trans Jews. And so we have ancient stories of trans Jews. And but the other piece that I think has to be addressed, if we're talking about tribes and partisanship, is that it is only Republicans who are doing this. It is the modern Republican Party that has declared a war on my family and on trans kids and on LGBTQ Americans. And I hate that this has become a partisan thing, but it is. It's only the Republican Party doing this. And, look, the New York Times, which has been rightfully criticized for the way that it has contributed to the problems in discourse around trans folks and trans rights, they had a big piece last week that was really looking at how deeply cynical this has been, that the Republican Party took all sorts of different hate and threw it at the wall to see what would stick, to see what could be a motivating factor that could unite them. And it turns out that creating and manufacturing fear and distrust and disgust around trans people, and that disgust word I think is important here, around trans people and trans bodies and trans kids in particular, has become their motivating factor. And right before we got on, Rory and I were in the middle of a conversation that I think is as much about tactics as it is anything else. I'm convinced this is fascism rising. I think it's the only word that describes what's happening. And it's not to say that, right, I'm not focusing on the ists. I'm not saying that all Republicans are fascists, certainly not voters. I'm talking about politicians here. But they're often in service to it. They're often in service to the fascism. And look, I'm following teachers like Jillian Brandstetter and Ruth Ben-Ghiat and Ezra Klein, who have really done deep dives into this in the way that fascism operates and what it looks like. And, look, it's Yom HaShoah today, right? And a line I keep repeating is this: not every 1935, or not every 1930 turns into a 1935, but every 1935 started with a 1930. And I think that's exactly where we are at today in red states in the United States when it comes to trans people. There is a war on the ability of trans people to exist. We have politicians, Republican politicians here in Missouri, openly cheering the idea that trans people and trans kids and their families should flee the state. They're working to create a legal regime that essentially outlaws the existence of trans people in public. And I don't know what the right words are. In the discussion Rory and I were having before, I think was around what tactics actually flame the fires versus what tactics can help quench them. I don't know the answer to that. I wish we had better answers. I feel like I need anti-fascist convention and training and things like that. But it's terrifying and it's getting worse. And that's what I think people need to understand is that it's getting worse, and these flames are increasing because they've realized that it works. It is the unifying factor of today's Republican Party today. And I'm not sure we're all ready for the reality that it's about to become the central issue of the 2024 campaign. But yeah, look, I'm scared. I'm really scared. Well, and yeah, Jim, please.
No, Daniel, I can't help but echo and agree with you. I mean, we can argue about and we should and discuss tactics and most effective ways to move forward. And as you and Rory were before the discussion today started, I think that's very legitimate. But I hate to be trite, but I'm going to be. To quote Pastor Martin Niemöller, whose words are so well known, but we quote it kind of in passing, kind of like, oh yeah, he said first they came for the socialists and I didn't speak out because, well, I wasn't a socialist. And then they came for the unionists and I didn't speak out because I wasn't one of them. And then they came for the Jews and I didn't speak out because I wasn't one of them. And then there was no one left. And I think you remind us that, and this is political, but it's not. This is not anti-Republican. There are lots of good people who vote for the Republican Party. But when people choose to permit and engage and support and encourage behaviors that you're accurately describing as fascist, we have to say something. And we have to say, really? So because of your economic policy decisions and opinions and preferences, you are going to enable and support candidates who are going to enact legislation that is fascist, that is attacking human beings at their very core right to exist. And this isn't political, but it has been made political. You're exactly right. And so I thank you for saying it and for your courage in saying it, even if I may agree that, well, there's still work to be done to strategize and find tactics to build coalitions, because not all people who vote Republican are necessarily in agreement, but they are enablers. And so we have to find a way to return to our core values, which is what I love, Micah, about what you've brought to us today.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And I think, I'm hearing a through line here that I want to highlight, or two through lines here that I want to highlight, right? One is we keep coming back to what is this difference between political and politicized, right? That when we poll voters across different political parties on the actual issues, we see a majority of voters of all parties supporting non-discrimination for LGBTQ people, supporting best practice medical care in consultation with the relevant parties who do not include legislators. And what we are seeing is a very cynical tactic of, even against those numbers, using fear, using that, that word disgust, not even because it's a core issue, but because it's been assessed cynically as the issue that will turn out the loudest minority. And I will name that what we're seeing happen is a variety of forms of legislation centering targeting trans youth, but also sweeping up and targeting any number of other people, being crafted sort of at the national think tank level and handed to communities to vote on. We are not seeing communities starting from a point of, we are scared because we don't know what gender affirming healthcare is and isn't, and so we want to regulate it. We have somebody coming from outside a community saying, I can make those words sound scary. I can make it sound like someone is experimenting on your children, even when the medical care involves using medications that have been approved for use in children for 30 years. And because I can make that sound scary, you should put it before your House and your Senate to draw attention to yourself, right? That is how fascism works, is it uses that fear and it uses a target and it uses a scapegoat. And I am convinced that many of the people proposing and voting on these laws aren't personally invested even in denying healthcare to an actual individual in front of them. They're invested in power.
And they say that when you talk to them, right?
Yes.
I mean, they say it openly, that they don't like, when you talk to them in private, that they don't like these bills, that they wish that they'd go away, but that they're too good for them politically to put away, which in some ways is even worse, right? Because that is how fascism succeeds.
Right.
Sorry, can I jump in, or I didn't want to cut you off? Okay, so yeah, I agree with everything that's being said, but I'm trying to figure out part of my own discomfort in this, because I think part of my own discomfort is that, and I think Micah, you actually just summarized it really well, right? Like that this is about using fear to convince a group of people that there's something wrong. Forgive me, like my language isn't all totally back in. Like I said, I just got back from vacation, but what it also is trying to like convince people. Let me say this differently. I think in some ways the best tactic against this, and I've said this on these calls in multiple ways, that sometimes our biggest power is questioning, right? If every one of us who heard these things stopped and said, hang on, who seeks to benefit? What's actually at play in all of this? I mean, Micah, I'm just thinking of like the number of conversations I've had with you over the years where like there was some rhetoric, and I want to totally admit, like I felt guilty to it because this is what people do. They come up with really good catchphrases. And so, we kind of absorb it. And then I can just think back to like the conversations I've had where you, Micah, like cut through some of that rhetoric for me. And I just thought, oh, no one ever said it to me that way before. And now that I've heard it that way, it makes total sense. But when you're just bombarded with something one way, then it's really easy to think that that's just a normalized opinion. So our best tool, and this I just want to say in general, is to always question the assumptions. This has been something that's been done throughout history. I mean, Jim, you're quoting Martin Niemöller, like we can keep talking about, right? Like that it is picking a group of people for people to be scared of, and then building political power over responding to that fear. And I think the Jewish community is and should be extra sensitive because we have been the subject of that fear. Refugees have been the subject of that fear. The Muslim community, the LGBTQ community, we can keep naming groups of people. What scares me at times in this conversation, and the part that I want to sit with, and I'm not accusing anyone here of doing it, but I'm questioning how do we balance it, is how in fighting against this fear do we make sure that we don't do those same tactics, right? Like if I'm going to then group all of the people who disagree with me as fascist, right? Like if I'm going to take this extreme, right? So now like we have two groups of people. We have fascists and we have pedophiles, right? And like those are your two choices. Then like we have a huge problem. And I hear, and I want to like make clear what I'm hearing in this conversation is I'm hearing this distinction of how fascism could be successful or fascist tendencies, not grouping everyone as fascist. But I get really scared when we start to just like make two-dimensional and flatten the argument, because if I'm going to then group everyone else together and then tell everyone vote against those people because you should be scared of them, then I feel like I'm no different than these other people. And then our pendulum just keeps going to the extremes, rather than, for me, I want to get people invested in what I'm hearing, like Micah, what you said, like, I don't know what gender affirming care is. Could somebody explain it to me? Like, that's the conversation I want to get people to. And so if I only have people, and that's an okay question, right? People don't know. If the only choices are either you're like, if you don't support trans kids, then you're a fascist. And if you do support trans kids, you're a pedophile, right? Like then our choices become impossible and we can't actually have a real conversation, and we could win or lose a single election, but we haven't actually moved ourselves forward as a community. And one of the things that scares me is that I know we're going to win this fight. I don't know if it's going to take 10 years or 20 years or how many years, but one of the things I keep talking about, particularly with my kids, is there's another group that comes next. So, right, like if we win this fight and all it does is kick the can down the road to say, stop paying attention to trans kids, instead be scared of somebody else, then we haven't won the fight at all. And so, yes to everything that you're saying, but I think as we're sort of saying, like we're talking about tactics, those are the fears that I carry with me in this discussion.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's why functional democracy has core principles, values, guardrails, and checks on power. Because if all democracy means is what's popular right now, or what can be made popular or unpopular right now has the force of law, then nobody's safe.
Micah, yes, I totally agree. I think, though, and Rory, I really am grateful for your framing what you're saying the right way, because, or the way you have, which I think is the right way, because for us, the question should not be only to Schreigewalt and say, oh, woe is us, but what can we do that actually will continue to move in the direction that I agree with you. Eventually, we will win this fight because we're going to continue to be in it as long as it takes. One of the curiosities, though, and I want to kind of point us back to some of the questions that our listeners today and watchers are asking. And Micah, maybe you can. I'm going to nominate you to try and begin answering this question. I think one of the things we need to do, is to acknowledge that we can start where we have real power and effectiveness, and that is within our Jewish community. I believe we actually do reflect, the four of us, reflect the majority of the American Jewish community. But there are those in our midst who do not share the same views. So, Micah, are you comfortable answering the question of, are there Jewish voices and authorities who claim to, who claim to support different positions than those that we represent? And Daniel, it sounds like you want to say something too.
I just wanted to jump in before we move the topic for a moment. I think one of the big differences, and this has come up in all sorts of different topics, is I'm a pessimist on the future of democracy, particularly American democracy. I think broadly democracy has been lost in this country, and I'm not sure it's recoverable within my lifetime in meaningful ways. I think we're going to go the other direction significantly. But I really don't like, and I understand the appeal of it, but it really bothers me, the language that we are going to win, because I do believe that our view for the basic human dignity of trans people and queer people and LGBTQ people is going to win. But it's the same objection I have to Yad Vashem and the Holocaust Museum in Israel, which ends with the overlook of gorgeous Jerusalem and sends this message of, Israel is the redemption for the Holocaust. There's this, I pulled it up. There's this quote by Ta-Nehisi Coates that I come back to over and over again. It's from Between the World and Me, which he writes as a letter to his son. He writes, "You must resist the common urge towards the comforting narrative of divine law, towards fairy tales that imply some irrepressible justice. The enslaved were not bricks in your road, and their lives were not chapters in your redemptive history. They were people turned to fuel for the American machine. Enslavement was not destined to end, and it is wrong to claim our present circumstances, no matter how improved, as the redemption for the lives of people who never asked for the posthumous, untouchable glory of dying for their children. Our triumphs can never compensate for this." And I come back to that over and over again because there are children who are dying because of what these politicians are doing, not because they believe it, but because they think it's good for them and they think that stirring up this hate is good for them. There are adults who are dying because of this, and there will be so many more children and adults, God forbid, who are going to die because of this, who are going to be effectively murdered by these people because of this. And I think visions that paint an irrepressible justice in the future and a redemption that is coming is so dangerous because it can obscure the fact that none of these people will get to live in that world. Yeah.
I appreciate that. I thank you for lifting that up. Like, really, I think that's incredibly important. I want to clarify, for me, I don't think that we're going to win because it's inevitable. I think we're going to win because I look around at this Zoom room and I think about all of the other people, and because I know that none of us here are giving up the fight. And so I just want to clarify, like, for me, I don't want anyone to sit back passively and say, oh, eventually, like, this will all sort itself out. This will only sort itself out if people continue to speak out and fight hard against it. So let's, like, make sure that we're incredibly clear about that. And I don't think there's anything righteous in this fight. Like, I would much rather, I think all of us here would much rather not be fighting it. Like, there's nothing sort of great about, being kind of correct. If you're right, people are absolutely going to be hurt, and we should never take that lightly. And I mean, I've joked around. I mean, Daniel, we've joked a lot, but like, I really respect your pessimism in it. And I need to get out of bed I don't know how to otherwise to get out of bed in the morning. And so I have to hold on to something, not because I think you're wrong, but because honestly, if I didn't, I couldn't and then just like a strategy. And so I've often joked with people that like, if they have one of us speak, they need to have both of us speak because I think we balance each other out kind of really well in that. But I don't want to be naive in the optimism. But I also know that there's times where I need to lie to myself about it because I think that's the only way that we move forward with it. And I'm not willing to give up on the idea that even if we can't completely eradicate this language, that every part of the fight still makes a difference. And I'll just say, I was in Jefferson City this year when the Senate passed the bills, totally by accident. I had volunteered to chaperone the fourth grade Mirowitz trip to Jefferson City. And so we were there and it was just excruciating. The fourth graders were about to go into the Senate and we were told by Tracy McCreary's legislative assistant, wait, because they didn't want to bring the kids in because there was such hateful rhetoric being spewed forth as people were debating these anti-trans bills. And this again goes back to what we're saying. It's not just about people saying, well, I want to protect kids. I mean, like there's hate, there's real vitriol that's coming forth. And so we were waiting there and we were starting to figure out, should we go to the House first? And then they called for a vote. And so I walked in right after, then suddenly it's all calm and like they're introducing the kids and the kids are all waving. And I went up to Tracy McCreary after the Senate adjourned. She came to talk to the kids and she had been part of the filibuster for fighting against the trans bills. And she was just crying, and I gave her a hug and I thanked her for what she did. And she was crying and she said, like, I'm so sorry we lost. And for me, and what I said to her in that moment also was like, the filibuster itself was also a win. Like for me as a parent watching that happening, and I remember them starting the debate on Purim. And I remember thinking like, here's a story about total powerlessness. And that's what I'm feeling right now. Like there's nothing I can do, right? And we were supposed to go and testify in support of the Missouri Non-Discrimination Act, which we knew was not going to pass, but they took away the hearing. And it just felt like this extra, like, we have power and you don't, and we're going to, we get to decide what you get to do and not do. And it felt like the most appropriate thing, like on Purim, to just talk about this total powerlessness. And I couldn't access any amount of hope. And then the next morning, like Purim day, that was Purim night, Purim day, Greg Razor and Tracy McCreary and Doug Beck and a number of other people, Lauren Arthur, started to filibuster. And I think I tweeted out, like, two people standing up to filibuster this bill when they have no hope of stopping it is maybe also exactly what Purim's about, right? Like people deciding that they're still going to speak up. And so, yes, like, did we lose in that the laws passed? Like, absolutely. And passed the Senate? Absolutely. Were there 6 or 7 people who were prepared to go all throughout the night to fight it? And then hundreds of clergy that we had started organizing to go to the Senate, that they didn't end up having to stay the night, right? But to like hold prayer vigil. Like I have to hold those as wins also. And that the discourse shifted, right? Like something changed along the way. So when I talk about winning, I don't only mean like we're going to win the whole thing, but I take every piece of that as a win. Like if we were only talking about end net result, sure. But like, there were hundreds of people who were surrounding us in that. There were legislators who were willing to go to the mat. And that's what I told Tracy McCreary, like, I'm going to carry that as a win, even if the vote didn't go the way I wanted it to go.
I very much appreciate that, Rory. And like, so much of this is dispositional between us too. I want to hold out in sort of as an addendum to what you're saying too, that actually at this moment, all of a sudden there is some talk that maybe these bills aren't going to successfully pass this year, having to do with the things that the Senate has passed in the House, and they're both sending them back and forth and running out of time. But the other thing is that the reason they may not pass this year is because once they pass, Republicans can't keep running on them. And we have a statewide election in a year. And I've had politicians say it in front of me, to my face, that they want to be able to keep running on this. They want to fanning this hate and this fear and this distrust and this disgust of my 9-year-old and your kid and of trans adults, and that they've realized it's good politics for them. And so, right, like, not passing these bills in some ways looks like a win, and in some ways is an enormous loss. And that's, look, these are the pieces that to me add up to fascism, that is fundamentally what we are facing. Now, I don't know the techniques or the tactics that we need to face, but right, like, is calling fascists counterproductive to fighting fascism? To me, that is a core question. And I like totally admit that I could be completely wrong on that, but I also think not calling them out could be completely wrong. And I worry that Martin Niemöller, I never say his name right, piece, right, like, one of the real takeaways I've had is I always thought of that poem, First They Came For, as being prescriptive, that it was teaching us a moral lesson. And I now really worry that actually it's just descriptive of how humans work. And I don't mean that, I know that sounds pessimistic, but I don't mean that in a pessimistic way. I mean it in a realistic way. And I don't think that we can protect our kids and protect trans adults and protect all of the vulnerable folks around us as they deserve to be protected as beautiful, shining images of the divine, unless we are looking really clear-headed at what the reality is and what works and how humans work and how societies work and sociology. And right, I think if we're not looking at reality, and don't hear me saying you're not looking at reality, because I absolutely think you could be right and I could be wrong on tactics. But I don't even know what else to say. I'm sorry, I'm on I think all of us, but Rory, I know the two of us in particular we're pretty dejected, and it's been spiritually destructive and exhausting and traumatic. And, we have friends who have trans kids who are fleeing the state already, who are leaving, who are making plans to leave, trans adult. It's a lot, and it's scary. And I'm not sure folks realize how often we are up in the middle of the night, and I'm including you in this, Rory, just scared of our government.
100%. And what I have to say about tactics, I don't have the key or the answer, but people can only run on that if it works. And it only works, right? This isn't something that's happening off in the legislative halls and there's no voice for those of us who are going about our day-to-day lives. It only works if people consent to be convinced by that kind of rhetoric. And maybe there's a key there, right? What do we say and how do we connect, and how do we, we've learned about the power of storytelling for making change. How is someone going to vote against the dignity and the safety of someone they've actually met and seen? And we've learned about talking values. We've learned about making space to build relationship across dramatic lines of difference. You're worried about the safety of children. I'm also worried about the safety of children. Let's be in conversation together about what that means, right? Not with a person who's running a campaign based on harming someone else, but to the person who's receiving that campaign. We have tools and we have tactics because it only works if people are willing to listen.
I agree. And I think we all need to keep all of this in mind, because again, we're talking about this right now, but there's always somebody that somebody's choosing to stand on. And you're right? But this is the problem. Like, this is where I think we're all complicit. We're all complicit because we all fall into it, right? And so I've become a lot more educated about the trans community because of my own experience. But if somebody were to suddenly start talking about something else, I wouldn't necessarily know. And it's easy. Like, for me, like, part of what's also helped me is, like, I've gone down the rabbit hole sometimes, particularly on social media, for the pro-life movement. And I find it fascinating as somebody who sits in the pro-choice camp, to like read what people say about me and how completely untrue it is is what gives me pause to say, maybe the things I believe about other people could also be untrue, right? Like sometimes you have to see it in yourself, right? Because like the people who are like, I mean, literally, and I've had people come up to me and say it, right? Who are like, pro-choice people want to murder babies as they're being born. And I'm like, doesn't happen. It's like a ridiculous, like it's just a ridiculous statement, right? Or like the idea that like they want to dance in the blood of dead babies, right? Like I mean these like gross exaggerations. But then I start to hear other things that people are saying. And look, I'm actually don't think like Daniel, I've been in those meetings with you. Like you're right, what those politicians say, like it's absolutely true, right? But the problem also is that like they know that it works, and they want power, and I'm angry about it. I'm incredibly angry about it, and that's the system that we have in place. But if we all stop doing it, like if we stopped voting based off of our fear and we actually started voting values, then people would actually have to stand up to values. And so that starts to make all the rest of us complicit in it. Like, I just want to share one other thing that was like a really interesting experience. So I said I just came back from vacation. So I was at Passover camp. I went away to Ramat Rome. It's one of the camps that's in Georgia, and they run this like 8-9 day retreat over Passover. And I had the privilege of being a scholar in residence there, which was just amazing. But one of the things, and someone else had actually requested, I wasn't sure that I wanted to do it, but somebody else had seen that I've been talking a lot about these issues and asked me to do a session about the anti-trans legislation. And they put it on for the second day. And I decided that what I wanted to do was talk about specifically the sports bills as, in some ways, I think like the most insidious versions of the bills, because the healthcare bills, like I actually find people sort of debate, like, should you step into healthcare? But the trans bills have been couched in this like notion of fairness. And this goes to everything we're saying, where suddenly it gives permission for people to be like, well, I'm not discriminatory, but like, it's really not fair for my daughter if she doesn't make the sports team because there's a trans kid who applies for the team, right? Like this is sort of the narrative, and everyone has an opinion because everyone watches sports or plays sports or heard of sports or knows someone who does sports or like in some ways like feels like they're allowed to have an opinion on sports. Whereas like I would never have an opinion on your healthcare decision. Like I don't know anything about your healthcare. And so I decided to sort of talk about it as like this entry point. I mean, sort of in some ways, I think kind of what the New York Times article then later did, but to say like, this is what gave people permission to start talking about these things. And it kind of blew up in my face. Like it started going hard because what I did was I picked like the most controversial thing. And there was like a group of people in the room who were like saying exactly what I just said, right? Who were like, no, but I don't discriminate, but I don't want a trans kid in the locker room with my kid. I'm not comfortable, right? All these things. And there was this moment where I was like, oh, I screwed this up. Like I shouldn't have done this. This is horrible. Because I had 1 hour, and 1 hour was not going to be enough time to like totally get into all of it. And also I then had like a week with a group of people that I was like, now I know all of you who are discriminatory. Like this is really uncomfortable. And so I also didn't talk about it on a personal level, right? Like I talked about it more publicly, but because my whole family was with me, there was no way for me to talk about this as something that touched my family without like it outing my family itself, right? As opposed to in other places where people don't have a chance to know my family. What was interesting though, in that moment was, like, so I left that session, like kind of hating people, like really like angry at a group of people and being like, I did this totally wrong. And then I had to live with them for another week. And what was amazing was they also had to live with me. And that's an experience I've never had before, because we do this, right? Like we go to Jefferson City, we fight with people, they testify, we testify, I rant about them, I think they're terrible, they go back to where they live, I go back to where I live. In this case, we all then like went back to dinner together. And now I had a week where all of these people, like it took a couple of days, but some of them kind of started coming over to me and saying, okay, I really want to understand what you were trying to say, because I don't think I totally got it. Right? Or I had a chance to kind of follow up with people, or suddenly like there was like some people, but we ended up at dinner together, and now like, or we ended up like grabbing a drink together, you know, or like at like a happy hour, and it totally transformed what turned into actually like a really beautiful experience. But I say it also because like we've lost that in the world, and I don't know how to do it, right? Like that was a retreat that we all chose to go to. But at first, where I was like, oh, I shouldn't have done this at the beginning, I was so glad that I had a week to sort of like break down my assumptions about them and their assumptions about me. And I don't know that I got everybody kind of where I wanted, but like we ended a lot of conversations with people being like, you know what, I'm still not sure I totally know how I feel about this, but you're right. It shouldn't be the government's job to figure it out. Like, you know, like I get that like schools should be having that discussion, camp should be having that discussion, the NCAA could have that discussion, but like maybe it shouldn't be what we run on or get elected on. And that was like a really, really profound experience that I just want to name. I don't know how we recreate it, but like it also transformed my own assumptions of realizing like I also walk away deciding I know everything about them and never have those chances to follow up.
Rory, that was beautiful. I see we're coming up on an hour. I want to like suggest that maybe we start kind of wrapping up a little bit, but I can't help but respond to two things you said in particular. First is this concept of complicity, that, you know, by saying, well, this isn't about me, or I can't do anything about it, or, you know, our very legitimate pessimism about whether we can change the tide and whether democracy is in fact in its final, you know, breaths of its life, God forbid, or any of the other things that cause us to end up being complicit by our silence, or complicit by our, you know, acceptance, or complicit by our, you know, depression and our despair. Micah, you started us off today by choosing the third of those beautiful values and reminding us that it is a core Jewish value not to stand idly by, not to be complicit, no matter what. And, you know, Daniel, you pointed out that today is Yom HaShoah. I mean, one of the great lessons of the Shoah was that we cannot be complicit by our silence. And there's a million ways for us to not be complicit. But complicity makes us both guilty, but it also, worse, allows the forces of evil to prevail. And the other thing I wanted to say, and Daniel, maybe I'm going to point this to you, but really it's not just to you, it's to all of us and everyone, is we're also told never to despair. You know, we are as Jews told never to despair, never to give up, no matter how hard the fight gets. And I know, and look, this is my fight. I share it with those for whom it is very personal. It's my fight because I believe it's right. And, you know, and I haven't done enough. I personally have not done enough. And I know that, and I hold that, I take responsibility for that. And that becomes dangerously close to complicity and to standing idly by. And so I say to the 40 people who are watching and joining us today, each of us has to take it upon ourselves to do something, to do anything, whether it's to act as advocates in the political process, or whether it's just to speak to people that don't agree with us, or speak to people who do agree with us. But that's our core Jewish value. It's not just to, you know, find things that support what we want to do in Jewish tradition. It's actually to know that these are core Jewish values. These are what we are here on this planet to do. And we can't give up the fight no matter how filled with despair we get. And that's really my final thought for today.
So Micah, do you want to take this last question that was in that I derailed us from before about there are other rabbis who think differently about this?
Yeah, absolutely. I could never claim that any four of us speak for the full complex breadth of the Jewish tradition. Yes, there are rabbis in Jewish communities that feel differently about these things.
Although Micah, we'd like to speak for the whole Jewish community.
There we go. There we go. Yes, there are rabbis or leaders who would quote different verses from Tanakh to bring as counters to these, or who would not have the language or experience for what does trans mean in order to apply these values. One of the things that I think, though, is really powerful is that Judaism has always been, in large part, about what do we do when the values we thought we understood behave in surprising ways when the world has changed. And it has always been about what do we do when two values we hold dearly appear to conflict, right? That is why we have a document called the Talmud. That is why we have a book of Deuteronomy, of Devarim, coming and bringing the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, to a place of completion and to the ark that it carries. And in every instance I have experienced, once we find the way in which the value of life and dignity is placed on the line, that changes how we sort through values that might appear to conflict. Because those values always win, right? The Torah teaches us when you are faced with death on one hand and life on the other, you always choose life. And the rabbis teach us that one's dignity is as precious as one's life, and that threatening one's dignity is spilling blood, right? And once we know that we have those, that we're in a situation that calls to those values, I have yet to encounter a place in Jewish text or tradition where those values do not ultimately carry the day.
I really, really appreciate that. I also think it's important to hold up that our position and what we have spoken of today is very much within the mainstream normative conversation of the American Jewish world. We can find examples of rabbis, particularly within the 9% minority of our American Jewish community who are in some form Orthodox, though obviously we have Orthodox folk who also feel very differently about this, who might disagree with us. But, look, the Reform movement is far and away the largest movement in American Judaism, with the conservative movement second. You read the 2023 position paper that the Reform movement just published, because you're not going to find a stronger statement of the dignity of trans people and how essential the work of protecting particularly trans kids, but every trans person from governments bent on harming them is. And I think if you look at all of the religious texts that have been, or statements by religious groups that have been released, I think the Reform movement is probably the strongest there has ever been. And I think maybe the second strongest is the Reform movement's position paper in 2015, which was a very different world. And then you go backwards to 1990, where there is a Reform tshuva that talks about how absolutely people who are trans can convert to Judaism. And then you go back to 1977, when there is a Reform tshuva encouraging Reform rabbis to officiate at the marriages of trans folk, right? This is a long, long tradition. You can find examples in the shtetl in the 1800s of trans people transitioning and being accepted and embraced. You can find poems from the Spanish Golden Age about trans Jews. You can forever and ever and ever, because there have always been trans people, because this is just another way of being human. And because Judaism has long seen that pretty clearly.
So I also want to just name, look, I don't think that this is purely denominational, right? We could have a whole other discussion about the ways in which our Jewish community is just shifting with American politics, and we're seeing some of this overlay. But as we've said, this has actually become a significantly partisan issue. And so we're seeing our Jewish community overlap with that in the same way that they overlap with every other partisan issue. And yes, like the demographics are showing that Orthodox Jews tend to vote more conservative, whereas Reform Jews tend to vote more liberal, but that's certainly not the exclusive purview of any one of the denominations. And so we're seeing some of that coming up. Glad you just had that ready for me right there as I said it. But I also want to say, I think there's another phenomenon that's actually happening, and maybe this is going to be setting us up for another session, because we're going to be running out of time really soon. But that's also the ways in which the Jewish community has started participating in the partisan discourse in a way that we haven't. Like, the Jewish community has been working really hard to engage in political discourse. That's been something that has been a focus of ours through the federations, through the JCRCs, through the congregations for many, many years, and wanting to have access to people in positions of power to advocate for our positions has been something that we've wanted for a long time. I think something that we've seen really shift in more recent years is using the political landscape to advance our own desires. And what I mean by that is that for a long time, even within Orthodox communities that tended to be more socially conservative on issues, there was still a push to say that they would still push back against legislation for socially conservative issues, because there was a recognition that if you started having legislation on these issues, what was to stop legislation that would then ban circumcision, ban kosher food, right? Ban our own practices in ways that we wanted the government to always step out of it. And so the idea that, right, even abortion, right? I mean, like, Orthodox communities still were categorically against abortion laws, even as they wouldn't agree with many other people in terms of when they would counsel someone to an abortion, because they recognized that as soon as government started restricting it, then Jews would also limit access. So what I find actually really fascinating that we need to start unpacking is that you suddenly have Jews who are really comfortable joining in on legislation that says we should ban abortion, we should ban trans rights, all these things that they believe, just kind of socially, but that they're not scared. We're suddenly, as a Jewish community, not scared that this becomes a precursor to releasing something that we will then lose control over. And that's something that I find really fascinating, that we think that we're enough a part of the power structure that we think we can control it. And honestly, I think we're wrong about that. And that's part of what I think really scares me. And so as we do see, like, whereas before you always had rabbis who disagreed, but they'd sort of do it privately, the fact that we now have people who are doing it publicly, I think is a huge shift in the Jewish community. And I think is going to actually have tremendous repercussions that we're not fully prepared for.
I think I totally agree with you, Rory, other than I tend to see these things as sociological oceans, and Jews are sitting on a tiny little boat and we think that our rowing is actually what's moving us, when actually I think these are the same sociological forces that are impacting everyone in America. And maybe that's what you're saying too, but I guess I would, I'm not sure this is really about our own agency, or that we have much agency as a Jewish community around this. I think it's bigger sociological and structural and systemic forces out there. I think it's what's encouraging partisanship. I think it's what's led to more and more politically conservative, Republican partisan Jews becoming part of Orthodox schools, even as they aren't Orthoprax, and progressive folks who really aren't engaged with Jewish life, sometimes joining progressive shuls as a way, right? Like we have this sorting that is happening along partisan lines that I think is showing that actually those structures are stronger than Jewish denominational forces or even Jewish identity forces, which I think many of us would regret deeply and wish we had influence and power and wish the world was ordered and worked differently and wished humans were different. But yeah.
No, I think you're exactly right. And so, no, I think that is exactly it, right? That this isn't uniquely Jewish. I think as Jews, we have a space to have this conversation. I hope, and part of what I'm so grateful, Micah, for what you've started us off with is couching this back into that values question, right? How do we, we're not exempt from all of these forces that are pushing us, but if we can keep putting ourselves back into this place, not of what are we against or what are we scared of, but who do we want to be and what do we want to stand for, then I think that's a tool that we have, that anybody has, right? But again, I'm speaking in the particular because that's who we are right now, to keep on pushing us back to that space. And so I just want to really thank you and thank everybody for joining us as we wind down, and maybe Micah, let you, if you'd like to just have the last closing word, as you've helped couch this for us and really helped drive us in this. I'm just so grateful for the work that you do, the work that Keshet is doing, and to all of you who are not exempt from this fight. There's a lot happening right now in Missouri, and all of us get to be part of it. And so I want to thank everyone for joining with us, and pass it to you, Micah, to close us out.
Amazing. Thank you. And it is, as always, an honor to be learning and in conversation with all of you. And I think I like to end every conversation with, what is it that gives you hope? Because hope, Daniel, I think you very powerfully named it, can be hard to come by. I will speak personally and vulnerably. Hope has been hard to come by this week for myself and for people that I love and care about deeply. And so when I want to bring us to this question of what brings me hope, is that there is tremendous courage, creativity, fierceness, connectedness, and care, a tremendous outpouring of care that I see from my trans community, from my LGBTQ plus community, and yes, also from my Jewish community. And when we can take that strength and the force of our voices in public, as a Jewish community, as an LGBT community, as Missourians, as human beings who are in community with other human beings, our voice is loud and our voice is powerful. So I want to encourage everybody who's been on this call today, please use it. If you need scripts, we've got those, right? That link we shared at the beginning, 7 Jewish Values for Action, those can be your scripts. There are even instructions. How do you use those scripts to speak for civil rights for people in your community? And please keep making your voice heard.
Amen.
Amen. Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. And we will be back next